The most famous fraud in history didn't start on Wall Street. It didn't involve gold, oil, or complex financial systems. It started with postage stamps. And somehow, that was enough to convince thousands of ordinary people to hand over their life savings. Because once the money started flowing, nobody asked too many questions. Neighbors were getting rich. Families were doubling their savings. And the fear of missing out became stronger than reason. So how did something this simple turn into a scheme that fooled an entire generation and gave its name to every scam that came after? Welcome, Doc Does Financial History. Money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. We call them Ponzi schemes. But in 1920, it was just Mr. Ponzi's deal. To understand why people lined up in the streets to hand this man their savings, you have to imagine what it felt like to live in his world. A world of neighbors whispering that someone down the block just doubled their money. A world of immigrants desperate for a shortcut to the American dream. A world where fear of missing out was more powerful than reason. That world looks uncomfortably familiar. The man at the center of it all was Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1903 with almost nothing. By his own admission, his early years were unstable, drifting between jobs, failing repeatedly, and often broke. He spent time in prison for forging checks and even got caught smuggling migrants across the Canadian border. He wasn't a financial genius. He wasn't a Wall Street insider. He was a hustler. But sometimes, understanding people matters more than understanding finance. The year was 1919. The First World War had just ended. The Spanish flu pandemic had devastated populations. Economies were unstable, and millions of people were trying to rebuild their lives. In cities like Boston, immigrants flooded neighborhoods with hope and desperation. They worked in factories, docks, and small businesses, earning just enough to survive. But survival wasn't the dream. They wanted more. They wanted a way out of the slow grind of labor. So when whispers began spreading about a man who could turn $100 into $150 in just 45 days, people paid attention. Ponzi's idea sounded complex enough to feel legitimate, but simple enough to believe. He claimed he had discovered a loophole in international postage. Because exchange rates after the war were unstable, it was theoretically possible to buy international reply coupons cheaply in one country and redeem them in the United States for a higher value. Arbitrage. A risk-free profit. At least, that's what he said. But most people didn't care about the details. They cared about the result. And at first, the result looked real. A barber invested a small amount and got paid. A shopkeeper doubled his savings. A widow saw her money grow faster than she ever imagined. Then they told others. And that's how the system spread. Not through advertisements. Not through official institutions. But through trust. Neighbors convincing neighbors. Families convincing families. Because if someone just like you was making money, then maybe you could too. Soon, the logic didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what people could see. Real cash. Real payouts. Real stories. By 1920, crowds formed outside Ponzi's office every day. People stood in long lines holding cash, waiting for their chance to invest. At his peak, Ponzi was taking in nearly $1 million a day, an extraordinary amount for the time. Banks began to take him seriously. Newspapers called him a genius. He wasn't just running a scheme anymore. He was becoming a symbol. But beneath the surface, there was a problem. The math didn't work. There weren't enough international reply coupons in the world to support the profits he was promising. Even in theory, his system couldn't scale. Because it was never real. Ponzi wasn't generating profits from postage. He was generating profits from people. More specifically, he was taking money from new investors and using it to pay earlier ones. A cycle, a loop, a system that depended entirely on constant growth. And for a while, it worked. Because success feeds belief. The more people got paid, the more others trusted the system. The more trust increased, the more money flowed in. And the more money flowed in, the more convincing the illusion became. It was self-sustaining. Until it wasn't. Eventually, questions began to emerge. If this opportunity was real, why wasn't everyone doing it? Why weren't competitors flooding the market? Why did Ponzi need other people's money if profits were guaranteed? These questions started quietly. Then they spread. Newspapers began investigating. Financial experts raised doubts, and slowly, confidence began to crack. At first, the crowds outside his office didn't disappear, but their purpose changed. They were no longer there to invest. They were there to withdraw. And that's the moment every Ponzi scheme fears. Because it can survive curiosity, but it cannot survive withdrawals. Ponzi tried to maintain the illusion. He paid investors who demanded their money back. For a brief moment, it worked. People saw others receiving cash and believed the system was still stable. But the reality was unavoidable. The money was running out. And once that happened, the collapse was inevitable. On August 11, 1920, Charles Ponzi was arrested. By then, thousands of people had lost their savings. Millions of dollars had disappeared. For many families, especially immigrants, the damage was devastating. They hadn't just lost money, they had lost trust. Ponzi himself faded into obscurity. He served time in prison, attempted more schemes, failed repeatedly, and eventually died in poverty. But his name survived, not as a success story, but as a warning. Every scheme that follows this pattern now carries his legacy, a Ponzi scheme. And yet, the story didn't end in 1920, because the same pattern keeps repeating. In 2008, nearly a century later, another man ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history, Bernie Madoff. But this time, the scale was far greater. This wasn't small investors on the street. This was Wall Street, banks, hedge funds, celebrities, charities. Madoff's promise was different. He didn't offer extreme returns. He offered consistency, steady profits, reliable growth, no volatility. And that made him believable, because it didn't feel like a scam. It felt safe. But the structure was identical. New money paid old investors. And as long as money kept flowing in, the illusion held. Until it didn't. When investors began withdrawing funds during the financial crisis, the system collapsed almost instantly. Billions of dollars vanished. And once again, the same story played out. Different names, different era, same pattern. Because at its core, a Ponzi scheme isn't about financial complexity. It's about human behavior. People don't invest because they understand everything. They invest because they trust. They trust what they see. They trust what they hear. They trust what others are doing. And sometimes, they trust the fear of missing out more than their own judgment. That's the real engine behind every Ponzi scheme. Not math. Emotion. That same psychology exists today. In speculative markets, in viral investment trends, in promises of easy money that spread faster than facts. The tools may change, but the pattern doesn't. Because fraud doesn't succeed just because it's hidden. It succeeds because people want to believe it. That may be the most important lesson in this entire story. Charles Ponzi didn't invent fraud, but he perfected the illusion. And that illusion still exists. Because somewhere, even now, there are new versions of the same story unfolding. Different names, different platforms, same promise, easy money, guaranteed returns, a shortcut to something better. And just like before, some will profit, most will not, and the system will collapse under the weight of its own design. Because history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of the Ponzi scheme is always the same. The few get rich, the many get ruined. And the cycle begins again. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.